More than 70% of the world has abolished the death penalty. There are currently 55 countries that still use capital punishment, some far more frequently than others. There's also significant differences in how executions are carried out from country to country. They range from lethal injection to hanging and even beheading. Why some nations opt for one particular type of death penalty while others use another is largely due to cultural and historical differences. The majority of the international community, including organizations like Amnesty International and the United Nations, are vigorously opposed to any form of capital punishment, no matter what the method being used is. The UN Human Rights Office has long supported the abolition of the death penalty, even though several of its member countries such as Iran, China, and Saudi Arabia have some of the world's highest rates of executions. By far, China carries out the greatest number of executions, followed by Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United States. In 2022, China was reported to have put 1,000 people to death, although this figure is highly debatable and it's believed to be much higher than that actually. In the same year, Iran made 314 executions, with 196 in Saudi Arabia, 34 in Egypt, and 18 in the US. Japan and Singapore are other notable developed countries that persist with capital punishment, although executions in these countries are far less frequent. Worth noting is that the means of execution differs notably from country to country. Most countries use what they consider to be the fastest and most humane methods, while others are still carrying on with traditional forms of execution. Lethal injection is the most used method in the United States, and other countries have recently adopted it as an alternative for more traditional means. Still, outside of America, most nations that continue to use executions tend to opt for other means. Hanging is one of the most common ways of carrying out capital punishment. It's used in Iran, Japan, India, Singapore, Malaysia, and Pakistan. Shooting is one of the other more prevalent methods, either by firing squad, as in Indonesia and Qatar, or by a single shot in the head at close range, which is the case in China, Belarus, and Taiwan. Saudi Arabia is the only country that continues to use decapitation for the death penalty, where a sword is used in place of a guillotine. So why are there different methods of execution used in different countries? It comes down to how different societies see themselves, as well as cultural traditions and the history of the country in question. For example, in the United States, lethal injection is currently viewed as the most humane way of carrying out capital punishment. Those advocating it claim that it's faster and it causes less suffering than other forms of execution, although there is evidence to suggest that that's not always the case. There have been several instances where the prisoner's nervous system has reacted against the injected drugs, delaying the process and resulting in astonishingly long deaths. Agonizing, even. It was first used in America in 1982, and some states have persisted with it because of its allegedly humane process. Proponents argue that lethal injection eliminates unpleasantries such as bodily mutilations, decapitations, burning flesh, and the excretion of bodily fluids. However, much of this relates to the reactions of onlookers and relatives, not actually those being executed. Whether lethal injection is more humane for criminals is certainly questionable. Some have been dragged out for as long as 2 hours, and the prisoner is sometimes paralyzed by the drugs and unable to cry out for help. Essentially, lethal injection seems to be a cultural choice. It's not as graphic as other means of execution and doesn't upset the sensibilities of societies who see themselves as more advanced and progressive. Not all the American states agree, though. States such as Utah have reintroduced the firing squad, as it's seen there as the fastest and most effective means of capital punishment. Other more traditional means of execution are also used throughout America. These include electrocution, the gas chamber, hanging, and firing squad. That's partly the result of drug manufacturers being reluctant to provide the drugs needed to perform lethal injections, for both moral and commercial reasons. Outside of the US, hanging is the most common form of capital punishment. There are two methods of hanging, the long drop and the short drop. The long drop is regarded as the fastest because the person falls further, resulting in a broken neck and a quicker death. And the short drop employs a shorter rope, and the prisoner usually dies from strangulation. Japan, Singapore, and India all use the long drop method, which was introduced by the British and Americans' colonial rulers. These countries have decided to stick with the long drop hanging as they see it as the most effective way. There may also be cultural factors at play as to why there hasn't been more debate in these countries regarding other forms of execution. Societies such as Singapore and Japan in particular tend not to question the powers that be and follow the status quo. If something's been decided by the government, then it's generally accepted and people go about their lives. Japan has used hanging for over 100 years, and no real discussion or attempts have been made to consider more humane means of executions. It's also important to note that the majority of the population in each of these countries supports retaining the death penalty. Countries with such beliefs are less likely to question the means and the manner of how the executions are carried out. Countries that opt for the firing squad, such as Indonesia, are simply convinced that it's the fastest method. Other countries, including Somalia, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, also use firing squads, along with other methods as well, while China and North Korea are also believed to use this practice. Now, it could also be argued that countries using firing squads may pride themselves on a symbolic show of militaristic power. Death by firing squads was originally used around the world in war, and its maintained use may reflect how some countries still place a high value on this imagery. Soldiers armed with rifles and carrying out executions strongly represent the ethos of using force to maintain control. The means of capital punishment very often reflects the type of government in charge. Saudi Arabia is a renowned authoritarian state, and some would even argue totalitarian. It is a country with strict bans on alcohol, very few rights for women, and it's run with an iron fist. With so much oil wealth at its disposal, Saudi Arabia can afford to snub its nose at outside opinions of how the country's run. Saudi Arabia is therefore unique in being the only country in the world to use beheadings as a means of execution. The beheadings are carried out with a single strike of the sword, usually in public. While Saudi officials claim it's quick and it's simple, there's a lot that can go wrong with the beheading. A sudden movement from the prisoner or a lapse in technique from the executor can easily result in a botched execution, and potentially excruciating injuries. The fact that Saudi beheadings are also done in public also comes as no surprise from a country with a strict authoritarian government. Decapitation is naturally abhorrent to most humans. The sight of someone's head being removed from their body would have a long-lasting impression on the onlooker, and to do so in public carries out a very clear message: fall in line, or else. Public executions are also known to be carried out in Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Somalia, countries also famous for authoritarian rule. Most countries are aware that their method of execution is seen as a reflection of their society. Death by lethal injection sends the message that, yes, we have the death penalty, but at least we're not barbaric about it. Firing squads equal no-nonsense, fast deaths. Hanging can be seen to reflect countries that hang on to tradition, and are unopen to considering other methods. Others may still stick to certain methods of execution simply as a sign of defiance to the rest of the world, as if to say, this is how we do things over here, and we're not going to be changing. So what is the future of capital punishment? In 1977, only 16 countries had abolished the death penalty, and that number has risen to today, 112, with other countries retaining it by law, but almost never using it. In the United States, public opinion continues to grow against capital punishment. More effective campaigns aimed at abolishing it have gradually led to a shift in thinking. Opponents argue that it doesn't prevent crimes that are carried out in the heat of the moment. There are also the concerning issues of mistaken sentencing and corrupt court procedures. In 2023, just 5 states, Texas, Florida, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Alabama, carried out executions. While experts agree that the decline in the use of executions is likely to continue, it's less likely that they'll be abolished forever in the US. There will simply always be support for it by members of the community and those in power. And as for the rest of the world, who can say? If a country is seeking to improve its image and standing on the international stage, abolishment of the death penalty could very well happen. Singapore and Japan in particular are the most likely to go with this option. Meanwhile, it's hard to see much changing with certain other countries in the near future. An intense belief in maintaining tradition with the strict governing of its people means that some countries are unlikely to consider change. You know who I'm talking about. And they'll also continue to argue that theirs is the most humane form of execution. And if you ask anyone who's opposed to the death penalty what the most humane form is, well, you're likely going to get the same answer: none.